listener production.
Hi, Sasha Barber-Gatt with you. Welcome to The Briefing. When we think about the effects of war on children, the psychological trauma of witnessing violence and the loss of loved ones is sadly all too known. But what is lesser known is exactly how these conflicts disproportionately affect young girls over boys, the brutal violations of their rights and the surprising ways they find escapism to cope with it all.
I don't think the world can afford for a generation of children and young people to not go to school and to be distressed by this experience in this way. I mean, it has lifelong consequences, the witnessing experience of this kind of horror.
That's the content of a new report released this morning by Plan International and a chat we're having in the second half of this episode. First, though, it is time for the headlines with Chris Spiru. It's Thursday, October 3.
Morning Sash, morning everybody. Organisers of pro-Palestine protests planned for October 7 in Sydney and Melbourne say they will push ahead, irrespective of government pressure and court rulings telling them not to. It comes on the back end of these comments made by Anthony Albanese on the ABC yesterday.
Well, there certainly shouldn't be any protests on October 7 because it would be seen, I think, as incredibly provocative. It would not advance any cause. It would cause a great deal of distress.
In New South Wales specifically, police have applied to the state's Supreme Court to stop a rally and candlelight vigil in Sydney this weekend, organised by Palestine Action Group. Police say they've tried to negotiate with organisers but aren't satisfied the events can proceed safely.
Protests in New South Wales operate under a permit system which gives police the power to oppose gatherings. However, the same system does not apply in Victoria, and Premier Jacinta Allen is being pressured to introduce the rules ahead of this weekend. Police there say they don't have any power to deny a protest from occurring, so long as it remains lawful, essentially non-violent, without breaching trespass and obstruction laws. And look, before we move on, an update quickly on the situation in the Middle East overnight. There are reports 8 Israeli soldiers have been killed in cross-border fighting in Lebanon. Yesterday, we weren't sure whether those IDF troops had actually crossed the border, but it looks like now that has happened. We have also heard from Joe Biden, the US president, who has warned Israel against strikes on Iran's nuclear sites, which is a really scary thought. Not only this conflict escalating, but nuclear weapons getting involved in it as well. But with that said, the US president has expressed his support for Israel defending itself, his words, after Iran's missile launch on Tuesday night.
Back home now, the Albanese government is preparing the latest phase of its crackdown on the big supermarkets, with plans to make it easier for us to spot when a product has been the victim of shrinkflation. So Sash, that's where you have a product, let's say a packet of chips for example, that continues to go up in price, but the amount of chips inside the pack dwindles. So last week's interim report from the ACCC found shrinkflation is a major concern for Aussie shoppers, especially when companies are able to hide it with clever packaging.
Yeah, so I guess the question then is, how will the government tackle the scourge of shrinkflation? And it is a scourge, it's a pain in the butt. So they want to do that through strengthening what's called the unit pricing code. That sets the rules for pricing products at the supermarkets and allows consumers to see cost by volume, weight or unit. The government will also look at improving the readability and visibility of unit pricing, making units of measurement universal and expanding the number of retailers covered by the code. So as you said, shrinkflation, what it looks like, you get less, you pay more. It's a pain. And consumer advocacy group Choice has found both Coles and Woolworths guilty of using this practice on some of their home brand items. And they also put together a list of some of the most commonly affected items. So cereal is one, chips is another, as we said in our example, and also cleaning products. One example found a bathroom cleaner back in May 2022. You got 700 mils for $2.50, but in March of this year, it was 500 mils for $4. So that means each 100 mils had increased by over 122%. So it's not just your food. This is happening right across the board. Plans to crack down on it.
We might finally have some good news for renters. Fresh figures from Domain have revealed annual rent increases in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth and Adelaide have hit multi-year lows. While still struggling with astronomical prices, the report has found the lowest September quarter growth rate since 2019 for houses and since 2020 for units.
It is a hopeful sign for tenants across the country who have been the victims of the longest and steepest rent price rise in Australia's history. A balancing out in supply and demand is thought to be contributing to this slowing trend, along with a 19% decrease in overseas migration since its peak in March last year. So good news, Chris, but with all that said, vacancy rates across the country still sit firmly below 2%, and rents, as you mentioned, are still really high, and it remains a landlord's market. But it is a sign. We've been talking about the rental crisis, especially here on The Briefing, for years. So to finally be seeing this signal that things are slowing down, I'm sure is feeling like a bit of relief for the country's renters. And it's NRL Grand Final week with the league's Best and Fairest awards happening overnight. Melbourne Storm halfback Jerome Hughes taking out the Dally M. He finished on 62 points, just 1 point clear of Roosters fullback James Tedesco. And Hughes was actually brought to tears when he was honoured with an impromptu haka by his teammates.
And that concludes our coverage of the 2024 Dally M medal.
Yeah, very cool to see. And yeah, he did. He got really teary in the eyes as he was watching, and then his teammates kind of came up and gave him a hug and congratulated him. So a nice moment from the Dally M's.
Oh, I love this so much. And this is the second haka story we've done this week, Sash.
It is.
And I'm glad you brought it up because we had someone reach out in our DMs at The Briefing Podcast about Tuesday's headlines where we spoke about New Zealand reclaiming the record for the world's biggest haka.
Yeah, we talked in the headline about how we don't really have anything that we've got records for, maybe meat pies, I suggested.
Mm-hmm. I recommended, I think, barefoot cricket on the beach.
Mm-hmm.
But listener Adam hopped in our DMs. Thank you so much, sir. And he said we forgot about Australia's world record as the country that boasts the largest amount of people doing the nutbush, which I completely forgot about, but it happened last year. It happened in New South Wales. It had happened actually a month before that in Queensland, where there were like some 5,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
New South Wales took the record with over 6,500 people doing the dance to Tina Turner's classic.
Oh, there you go.
In the bush. So yeah, I love it. Yeah, thank you, Adam. Thanks for reaching out. Thanks for keeping us accountable.
Absolutely. Fact checking us. And that's an iconic Aussie thing, the nutbush. No one else does the nutbush dance. The song exists everywhere else, but the dance is uniquely Australian. So I'm glad we hold that record. And if anyone tries to come for it, I'll organise a counter dance myself.
You, I, and listener Adam will be there supporting this move.
For the headlines today, look, we are changing pace next up with a really confronting report by Plan International about how war impacts young girls. But there is a glimmer of hope, and it talks about how these young girls are using escapism to help cope with it all.
When we think about the civilian toll of global conflicts, we usually speak in terms of the number of casualties or maybe even the latest territorial invasion, or perhaps framing it as though it's a military gain. But particularly over the past year, you would have heard us on The Briefing reading out headlines that go along the lines of this: X amount killed and hundreds others wounded, women and children make up most of the dead. The latter of the two, children, the focus of a new report published this morning by Plan International. It surveyed over 10,000 young people across 10 countries currently experiencing armed conflict. And those countries include Cameroon, Ethiopia, Lebanon, the Philippines, Sudan and Ukraine, and also one country that is unable to be named because of political and operational sensitivities, is what the report says. This report was first published in 2007, titled State of the World's Girls, and for the first time it's been widened to include young boys, and it offers a deeper look into how conflicts are experienced differently by gender. Joining me is the CEO of Plan International Australia, Suzanne Legina. Suzanne, welcome to The Briefing. The research is now in its 17th year. So what is the state of girls in the world in 2024? And have things got markedly better since data collection began all those years ago?
It's a really good question. This year's report is called Still We Dream, and it's really the story of not just girls but young people in conflict, living through conflict. And what that is showing us is that actually conflict can set back any gains that you've made in relation to sort of gender equality, because almost overnight everything can change. And what we've seen in the research is that those sort of gender stereotypes get sort of confirmed when things go wrong and your family's under pressure. Sometimes the harmful practices that people have been able to move from, people go backwards because they're fearful and scared and because there feels like there's no other option.
And so where specifically, because I know the report looks at a range of different indicators and experiences, where specifically are things clearly going backwards?
This study in particular focused on 10 countries currently going through some kind of conflict or armed conflict. And recently Save the Children did a study, and they said that if all the children currently living in conflict were put into one country, it would be the third most populous country after China and India. So that's just trying to give you a sense of the scale in 2024 of the number of children and young people actually living in a conflict or armed conflict context. It's absolutely remarkable. I mean, the focus is on the Middle East at the moment, rightly so, but there are so many other places. Think about the Ukraine, Sudan, Cameroon, where children are living in this situation. And in all of those places, their experience of like accessing basic things like food, water, education is markedly interrupted by the circumstances that they're living in.
And Gaza has been cited by a range of human rights organisations as the most dangerous place on earth to be a child. But the Plan team had limited access to children in Gaza. So what sort of insights could you actually really get from there?
Yeah, so we surveyed 10,000 children aged 15 to 24 around the world in these 10 countries. Palestine wasn't one of them. Gaza wasn't one of them.
May I ask why not? Why Gaza wasn't included?
Well, they're just difficult safety concerns. We don't have access currently to Gaza. Our local partners do and are providing food, but they weren't in a position to do the kinds of interviews. Often girls were not going out because it was unsafe to do so. So what we were able to do was have some in-depth interviews with some young people in that place, and we were able to listen to their voice in that context. So it was more secondary research in this case.
And what did you get from those interviews?
One of the stories is a young woman called Fatima who's 23. She's just describing sort of the horror of her daily life, you know, not being able to access education, just living in constant fear of airstrikes, moving from place to place, shortages of food, seeing and witnessing terrible and horrible things that kind of haunt her dreams. The thing about her that I kind of was struck by is she also talks about trying to keep her hope and her dreams alive. And she dreams of being a photographer. She tries to continue to take photographs and write poetry. And that becomes a way for her to sort of maintain some kind of normalcy. And it's helping her survive what is really one of the worst situations in the world to be a young person.
And the report also spoke to boys for the first time. Why was the decision made to include boys' experiences?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. The way that armed conflict and conflict impacts on boys and girls is different, but it is gender-based. So what the research showed us, for example, is that girls have a much higher rate of gender-based violence. We're talking here about either experiencing sexual assault or rape or witnessing it. But boys have much more chance of being co-opted into armed groups or being pressured to join militias, etc. And this becomes a huge issue for them too. By virtue of being boys, they're expected to take up arms and fight. So it was really interesting to capture it. And also we wanted to see whether there were differences between boys and girls in the way they experience conflict. And it showed that there were marginal differences between girls and boys in terms of access to food, water and feelings of safety, even access to phones. There's a difference between girls and boys. So that ability to connect to your friends or stay connected to your family. But they were kind of marginal. The big two differences really related to your risk of or feeling of being unsafe and your exposure to sexual violence. though 1 in 6 boys were experiencing that too, can I just say? Like, once you're in this context, it's a very dangerous place for children and young people to be, regardless. And yes, boys talking about their fear of being co-opted into these sort of armed groups and their worry about that.
And Plan International first published the State of the World's Girls Report in 2007. Has anything improved? Sometimes we need to look for glimmers and pockets of hope.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, across the world, you are seeing more girls completing secondary education. You're seeing fewer girls getting married in the way that they used to be in terms of child marriage. So that remains a huge issue across the world. There have been gains in sort of harmful practices like FGM that is being reduced. People are changing their views in relation to that.
What is that?
So harmful practice like female genital mutilation.
Oh, right.
You're seeing that rates of that are going down in many places. Certainly the big one that I think is a game changer is seeing more girls complete secondary education in many places. That means you get the chance to do further study or have additional skills that you can apply to like work and getting jobs and improving your economic situation. And so that has generational and positive impacts. Certainly there are gains being made, but disaster and conflict are two contexts where some of those gains get pushed back. And certainly the young people in this report talk a lot about missing out on schools closing or being dangerous to get to. And missing out on school is really hard because not only are you not learning skills and it's kind of robbing you of your future potential, but you miss out on the sort of normalcy of just being young and hanging with your friends and having that sort of structure and rhythm to your daily life that helps you sort of navigate what's going on.
It could be easy to say, well, these conflicts are happening in the Middle East and in Ukraine and Russia and parts of Africa. What could we possibly do about it? We have seen in recent weeks Penny Wong and her stance on gender apartheid and Afghanistan. What role do you see Australian governments and policymakers playing in the safety of children around the world?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Let me start by saying that the thing that I just felt about reading this report was this idea that conflict robs a generation of children, a generation, I'm saying this very particularly, of children of a normal, happy and safe childhood. And when it breaks out, it interrupts everything about your, feeling safe, going to school, being with your friends, surrounded by your families. I don't think the world can afford for a generation of children and young people to not go to school and to be distressed by this experience in this way. I mean, it has lifelong consequences, the witnessing experience of this kind of horror. So what is the role of governments that represent the people is that we absolutely have a role to play in trying to broker ceasefires and peace negotiations in all of these places that allow for children and young people to be safe and to be young and to have a childhood and have the chance to grow up safe and healthy and educated. Because if we don't do that and you lose an generation of people across all these places in the world, third most populous country it would be, remember that. What does that actually mean for the future prosperity, sustainability and peace of all of our nations? So without doubt, I just think this was a wake-up call to me that all of us care about children, whether they're our own, our nieces, our nephews, and all the children are ours. And wherever they are, we have to care about them. And so the role for our government, I think, is really to keep that call out for peaceful, diplomatic solutions to these, yes, complex problems, but clearly armed conflict and war is not the way to be solving them.
I guess what has changed since the report began in 2007 is the uptake, proliferation of social media. What we're seeing now is images of children in conflict zones in a way that we have never been exposed to before. I guess this could have two impacts. It means more people bear witness, but does it also run the risk of desensitizing the masses, or we lose the ability to care when we're constantly seeing harm and suffering that children endure live streamed on our phones?
It's a really good question. I actually don't know the answer to that. I think that the kinds of images we've seen coming out of Gaza, but also that I've seen young people posting from Sudan and the Ukraine and other places, To me, young people have played this really important role in themselves being the agents of the message of actually calling on the international community to do more and to just describe what it's like for them. It's haunting. I feel that myself. I'm a humanitarian working in this organisation. Sometimes I have to get my news not from social media because I can't bear one more image of a child being harmed or hurt in the way that I've seen. So for so many of these children, they're seeing the worst of what humanity can do. And I think the call out for me is that it's on us, the rest of us in the world, to show them the best of what humanity can be, that we actually do care, that we are allies in this, that we do want and support them to have a life that is happy and healthy and allows them to be children. And so the call out for me is for the rest of us, to put pressure on our governments and do everything we can to send those young people and children a message that they are not on their own and we do care about them and we do not just bear witness, we do more than that. We try to take action that would make the world better for them in some way.
So any sort of granular practical tips you can leave our listeners with?
Yes.
About how they can get involved?
I know that it feels overwhelming and sometimes it feels heartbreaking and that can leave you feeling paralysed, like there's nothing you can do. But there are lots of things you can do. Next week is International Day of the Girl. Plan will be trying to raise funds for the much needed work we're doing in all these places, but there are organisations all over the world who are helping children and young people in this context. You can write to the government and ask them to do more to broker peace and ceasefires. You can not turn away. You can take action every day in some way to remind people in your life that anything that dehumanises others puts at risk us forgetting that there are children and young people in all of these places that are loved just like we love our children and that they are all worthy and deserving of care, safety and a chance to be children and to be young.
Beautiful words and sound advice. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Antoinette.
Suzanne Legina, Plan International Australia's CEO. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing, and that is it for now. But of course, before you go, I have to ask you to like, share, review this episode. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. We're also on TikTok and YouTube. Just search Listener Newsroom. We'll be back in your feed with another episode this afternoon from 3. I'm Antoinette Lattouf. See you next time.
Listener.